The Second Arrow by Joshua Charland. I tried for several years to distill the essence of Buddhism into an easily digestible bite-sized morsel, into something that even someone who did not know anything about Buddhism could easily walk away from and understand what Buddhism was and what the Buddha was trying to do. I'm not convinced it is possible, yet here I am again. LOL. Buddhism is essentially the cure for the human condition, a step-by-step guide to how to create happiness and transform and avoid suffering. It's a practice and a philosophy. It's a way of living that heralds insight, ethics, and deep reflection as a means to minimize our self-inflicted suffering. It requires honesty, humility, and an unrelenting desire for the truth, and in turn allows us to reveal our true nature and our true nature of reality. That's the best definition I've come up with. When I read it, it sounds a little crazy, like something a cult leader would promise, but unlike something as flimsy as a promise, Buddhism does not ask you to believe anything. Buddha did not ask for belief. He asked that people go out into the world and disprove his teachings. He invited people to publicly argue their points against him. He knew that if put into practice, it worked. The beauty of Buddhism is that it is not a teaching of knowledge. Knowing about Buddhism doesn't do anyone any good. The effectiveness is in the doing. We will focus on one concept within Buddhism at a time, the second arrow. The second arrow is often depicted as the first teaching of Buddha. This is not always the case, but it is always one of the first along with the Four Noble Truths. It is often first because without this realization, much of our suffering and trauma remains unalterable, a fixture in our personalities or the cornerstones of our identities. Life is unpredictable. We cannot possibly ready ourselves for everything that may come our way. Inevitably, often through no fault of our own, we become wounded by life. This can be imagined as being shot with an arrow. This arrow comes from life. This arrow represents things like old age, sickness, death, heartbreak, loss, abuse, etc. Any unavoidable pain that might be brought upon by us. That may be brought upon us. That's what it is. I have to tell him he needs to fix this. Any unavoidable pain that may be brought upon us. We cannot dodge this arrow. This arrow we all must bear. The second arrow is the self-inflicted suffering that arises from our emotional reactions to the first arrow. It's the negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that come as a result of the initial pain. We can imagine a second arrow creating a second wound in the same spot. This is a wound inflicted by ourselves. We created this wound and only we can make it cease. The wound this arrow creates does not always heal with time. It can linger and fester and infect our minds in a way that affects our entire lives. The second arrow is also a subtle wound, so I'll give some examples of the second arrow principle. A first arrow could be receiving negative feedback on a project or endeavor. A second arrow would be internalizing that feedback as personal failure, spiraling into self-doubt and negative self-image. A first arrow might be someone forgetting your name or forgetting to call you. A second arrow would be thinking, they don't care about me, or feeling insecure and hurt. A first arrow could be a stubbed toe or paper cut. A second arrow would be getting angry at yourself for the situation, further increasing the discomfort. A first arrow might be a grandparent getting sick. A second arrow would be ruminating on why this is happening to your family and regretting not spending enough time with them. A first arrow may be someone stealing from you. The second arrow, the development of a suspicious, untrusting, angry nature. In essence, the second arrow is the self-blame, self-criticism, and negative self-talk, the suffering that accompanies the initial pain of the first arrow. It often lasts much, much longer. Here's a personal example. When I was a child, my parents, like a lot of parents, drank alcohol and used drugs. This created many experiences that caused me to feel unsafe. This was my first arrow. I could not avoid this trauma. As a teenager and a young man, I carried the anger, hurt, and doubt I felt from those experiences with me. This was my second arrow, a wound I gave myself. As a result to a wound I received from someone or something else. I did this for many years until I came to the realization that only I controlled whether those feelings existed, that I was creating those feelings. I couldn't change what happened when I was a child, but only I could change how I felt about it in the present moment. And changing how I felt about it now changed my life for the better in almost every way. To do this, I had to employ many Buddhist techniques. They were unknown to me then, but I used them nonetheless because the Buddha's teachings are so intuitive, so utterly practical and in tune with human psychology that we use them all the time without knowing it. In essence, I had to examine the true nature of my first arrow. I had to touch the reality of the situation. To do so, I first had to understand the source of my initial suffering. The easy answer was my parents' irresponsibility. But if I looked deeper and tried to understand who my parents were when I was a child, the truth was far less simple. I had to realize that my parents were traumatized as well, very likely as children, and their upbringing, their trauma affected their ability to make me feel safe. And if they could have done things differently, they would have, but they were working with a very limited toolbox. This took away the idea of what should have happened. For a long time, I felt that my parents should have been better, that they should have known better. When I came from this place, I could justify my hurt and anger. Its presence in my life made sense, but when I came from the idea that what they could have done at that time, given what they were dealing with, when I looked closely at the whole picture, I found that my parents became less dense. And when I approached my parents with any amount of compassion, when I allowed myself to understand the rich tapestry that created the situation that allowed me to feel unsafe as a young child, the anger and hurt, it felt completely unnecessary. Its presence in my life waned, and after some time I truly realized how intertwined those feelings were in my life, how I built my whole identity around those feelings, and to what extent those feelings dictated what I did, what I said, and who I was. I was able to understand, and although I had been initially harmed and suffering was brought upon me, that I contributed greatly to my own suffering. I created long-lasting wounds within myself that only I could tend to. Once I realized this, I could really begin to heal and explore my true self. This example outlines the depth of the second arrow. Its effects often outlasts and creates more suffering than the initial wound. Many times there is a third and fourth arrow, as we have secondary emotional reactions to the circumstances of the initial reaction. For example, if my feelings about my parents caused me to bring harm to someone else, this would set off a cascade of negative emotions about myself, deepening the wound and creating others in a never-ending cycle of harm, guilt, redemption, and confusion. As we go through Buddhist concepts, it will begin to become clearer that Buddhism is less of an exotic Eastern philosophy and more of a practical deep dive into human psychology. Thanks for reading. More to come. So Josh is my husband, and he is also a collaborator in the Enlightened Network, and he writes essays on Buddhism. And I like to read his essays, so you have the option of reading and listening and revisiting in this way, whether you're driving or you're taking a walk and you pop in some earbuds, to explore, especially this second arrow. How many situations in your life has there been the first arrow, the one that we don't control, the wound of an external circumstance that affects us, and then the second arrow, especially as you get older, where you are reacting to the first arrow, and in that reaction you cause yourself so much suffering. Now that's a point of exploration that the Buddha is talking about when we talk about the second arrow. So I'd love to hear from you, if you have any recognitions around this, awarenesses, the light bulb went off. It can really be in an instant, these realizations as to how you can heal your own life just by understanding where the wound comes from, and it's really our reactive nature that causes us to suffer, and we have control over those reactions. So Thanks for listening.